15.
Usually when people say someone needs no introduction, they follow it with an introduction. But apparently I literally need no introduction, which I'm not sure I believe. So I have some hesitancy about this subject tonight. I have some hesitancies about this subject, generally speaking, which I think are actually speak to the virtues of this subject. But one of the hesitancies I have tonight in particular is that I'm not in New York. And I am used to thinking about this book. This is a Haggadah, which is the most easy way to describe it is as a ritualistic Jewish book. And in New York, even the Gentiles are basically Jewish. I had a friend who visited America from London, and we were talking about his impressions, and he said, no, it's very similar to London, but one thing that puzzles me is why are all the porn stars Jewish? And I said, no, everybody's circumcised here. Everybody, that's just the way it is. And my impression is that in London it's not exactly the same. That there might even be a sense in which all the Jews are basically Gentiles. But I'm sure somebody's going to correct me afterward for having said that. When I arrived at Heathrow on Saturday, I found myself getting interrogated by one of the immigration officers. And for whatever reason, for whatever I think extremely unlikely reason, I seem to have this problem every time I come to England. This is despite my glasses, despite my relatively diminutive stature, despite the profiling that normally goes into these decisions, and the general absence of anything that would connote terror. But if anything, I think I usually put people at ease. But for whatever reason, in these situations, I managed to convey the impression that I'm somebody who is deserving of questioning. So he looked over the immigration form, and he said, so it says here that you're coming to England on business. What kind of business? And having had this experience numerous times, I thought, just give him the simplest answer. What is the simplest, most innocent answer? And I said, I'm here to talk about a book. And he said, is this a book of yours? And I said, well, that's actually a complicated question. I can't, it's kind of mine and it's kind of not mine. And he said, that's a complicated question. Well, is it a work of fiction? I said, well, yes and no. I couldn't exactly say yes, I couldn't exactly say no. And he said, well, what kind of book is it? And I said, have you ever heard of a Haggadah? And he said, no, I've never heard of such a thing. And I said, have you ever heard of Passover? He said, no, I've never heard of Passover. I said, have you ever heard of Jewish people? And he looked to the side and he signaled for one of his peers to come join us. So obviously he let me pass. I wouldn't be here if he didn't let me pass. But that exchange reminded me of what a very, very difficult book the Haggadah is to describe. It is sort of fiction, and it is sort of nonfiction. It is sort of a prayer book. It's sort of a work of history, sort of a work of philosophy. It's sort of a user's manual. It's sort of a timeline. It's sort of an ethical argument. It's sort of a poem, and it's sort of a palimpsest. But it's not exactly any of those things. Jews have a special relationship with books. And the Haggadah has been translated more widely and reprinted more often than any other Jewish book. Everywhere that there have been Jews, there have been Haggadahs. The Torah is the foundational text for Jewish law, but the Haggadah is our book of living memory. It does not merely tell a story. This is what made it so hard to answer this guy's questions. It demands a radical act of empathy, and I would argue the most profound demand made by any book of any kind published anywhere. We're asked not merely to receive a story, but to reenact it, to feel as if we ourselves are being liberated from Egypt. Thousands of years later, half a world away, ink on paper is supposed to place us there. Now, to take a step back, I will tell you precisely what I told this immigration officer and his cohort. Passover is the most widely celebrated Jewish holiday. The Seder, which is the festival dinner occurring on consecutive nights in the spring, is the annual retelling of the Exodus from Egypt. Seder means order in English. And to follow the established order, the ritual actions, the prayers, the songs, and the story itself, families rely on the Haggadah. Most simply described, and this is really how I should have described it at the airport when I was given the opportunity, it is a user's manual for the holiday, and you can't celebrate without one. Now, for as long as I've been alive, I have attended Seders at my parents' house. I think the first Seder I attended, I was maybe 5 weeks old. As our family matured, and as it expanded, and as our Seders became more inclusive, to include other family members and friends, we moved the proceedings from our dining room table down into the basement, and one table became many tables pushed awkwardly together, I should say. There's a plastic folding table, there's a ping pong table, whose net we would remove in an effort to pretend it was a table to be seated at. There's our bumper pool table, we had 4 card tables, and they were all covered in matching, if very badly stained, tablecloths. And at each setting was a Haggadah that my father would cobble together the week before Passover by Xeroxing his favorite passages from other Haggadahs, and more recently by downloading and printing online material. As some of you might know, the sort of quintessential question of Passover is, why is this night different from all other nights? Because on this night, copyright doesn't apply. Since 1934, the Maxwell House Haggadah, as in the coffee company, has been the world's most used version of this most exceptional of all books. It's distributed for free, and in America, there are between 40 and 50 million copies in print. I should say, by the way, that about 77% of all American Jews go to a Seder. It's probably about the same here. 250,000 Jews go to Seders on the Upper West Side of Manhattan every year. The Maxwell House Haggadah, as I was saying, is the most used in the world, and it's about as inspired as you would imagine it to be. But fortunately, there are about 4,000 other versions of Haggadahs floating around. They've been made at, as I said before, every moment in Jewish history wherever there have been Jews. And these other versions range from a kind of crude and utilitarian to some very sophisticated and embellished works of art. In 34 years of attending Seders, I never found an intellectually and aesthetically satisfying Haggadah. Nothing that I would consider a great book by the standards that I use to judge secular books. I never saw writing that was as good as the writing reviewed in the New York Times Book Review. And I never saw design that felt as good as the design that was in MoMA's design shop, for example. Maybe that wasn't the best of all examples, but you know what I mean. Or maybe more precisely what I mean is I never found something that was a really good fit for my family. Nothing that facilitated the kinds of conversations that I thought were so important to me, even when I was a boy. Because of the dramatic story it tells, and because of the questions that it raises and the images that it inspires, because it is among the oldest of all stories, and the most recognized of all stories, and the most dramatic of all stories, the most provocative of all stories, the Haggadah really should be a great book. It certainly lends itself to creativity and to thought. But more than that, because of the themes that it explores, exile, slavery, and the perpetual movement toward freedom, and because its audience is so unusually large and captive, it really should be a great book. The Seder is more than anything else a protest against despair. The universe, we say to one another and believe, might appear to be deaf to our fears and hopes, but we're not deaf to our fears and hopes. And so we gather and we share them and we pass them down. We've been waiting for the moment, the metaphorical Jerusalem of next year, for thousands of years. More than 100 generations of Jews have celebrated Seders, have relied on Haggadahs, and will continue to wait for it, but we won't wait idly. I am not an observant Jew. Perhaps that's a surprise, perhaps not. And I wouldn't be considered by almost anybody's definition of religious, and not by my own definition. But this oldest of rituals, which conveys the oldest of stories, couldn't possibly feel more contemporary and important to me, especially now that I'm a father. Religion really snuck up on me as a parent. This is something that Elaine didn't mention earlier, but seems to me central to any discussion of the use of religion is raising children. Throughout my childhood, I spent my Sunday mornings and Wednesday afternoons promising my future children that they would never waste their Sunday mornings and Wednesday afternoons at Hebrew school. And yet, when the time comes, and I'm still a couple years away from this, it's very hard to imagine doing anything terribly unlike what my parents did, or what their parents did, or their parents' parents, parents. Traditions of all kinds direct and compel my parenting choices. This is true of everything from the kinds of breakfasts that I cook for my kids to the kinds of stories that I read to them at night. But so does the desire to get it slightly more right, to put lessons learned in my own life to use, or simply to shape traditions to fit the contemporary moment. We're raising our children as vegetarians, and we often invent the stories that we tell them at night. So it's a balancing act, and I do think this is the balancing act that Alain was gesturing at earlier. How do you bind yourself to the old without binding yourself? The need for a new Haggadah doesn't imply the failure of existing ones, but the struggle to be bound without being bound, to engage everyone at the table in an ancient story in a time that's unlike any that has come before. Our translation, therefore, has to know our idiom, and our commentaries have to wrestle with our conflicts, and our design has to respond to the way that the world looks to us now and feels to us now. So the Haggadah that I've edited makes no attempt to redefine what a Haggadah is or to overlay any particular political or religious agenda. Like all Haggadahs before it, it hopes to inspire radical empathy. And like all Haggadahs before it, it hopes to be replaced. As the words of my Haggadah are read at my family's Passover this year, as my family's ink-stained fingers turn its wine-stained pages, new Haggadahs will be written. And as future Jews at future tables read those Haggadahs, other Haggadahs will be written. New Haggadahs will be written until there are no more Jews to write them, or until that forever distant day when there aren't any kinds of slaves anywhere, and there's no more need to say, next year in Jerusalem. So I thought I would end by reading a very, very tiny passage from this Haggadah. It's a commentary about one of my favorite moments, which is when God responds to the groaning of the Jewish slaves. And it's a very precarious and suspenseful and puzzling and fraught moment, as are almost all of the moments in this book, by the way, which is precisely why it's sustained itself. And this is why I think that it is fraught, and this is what I think the sort of response to that fraughtness is. And is also, in a way, why I put this book together at all. The most theologically shocking moment in Exodus is not when God appears in the burning bush, or splits the Sea of Reeds, or even when he gives the Ten Commandments at Sinai. It's when God remembers his covenant. How can a God who is so close at hand in Genesis that he spoke directly to Abraham, overheard Sarah laughing, and wrestled with Jacob face to face, be so far away when their descendants are enslaved in Egypt? Exodus suggests an answer that's both simple and horrifying. God, who spent the better part of Genesis cultivating the people of Israel, has, by only the second chapter of Exodus, forgotten them. Here, stripped bare, lies the theological root of one of the deepest fears in our collective psyche, the fear of forgetting and being forgotten. And yet, according to the Haggadah, there's a remedy for God's amnesia: our voice. Just as, later in Exodus, Moses commands Israel to remember this day on which you departed from Egypt from the house of bondage, For with a strong hand, God removed you from here. So too, if we want a relationship, we must remind him with wails, if necessary, to remember his covenant. But what would those wails sound like today? Thank you.